So today, we're talking about materials, but we're also talking about a lot of the foundational things that you need to work with materials. So references, the lighting panel, just an introduction to roughly what shaders are, what materials are, and then how to work with them. So going back to our little homework pieces, we will actually see if we can take a bit of a stab at those today. And if you look at each of these scenes, you can kind of break them down into a few different elements, right? If you're looking at it from a scene creation perspective, like we looked at some skyboxes yesterday, and you can see like each of these scenes have like similar but like distinct kind of skybox that goes with them. Like obviously this one's got a night sky, this one's got like a clear like hazy sky, and this one's got a bit more of like a temperate sky. But you can see you can kind of break these down into their individual elements and start to get a feel for how you might be able to recreate a screenshot like this from inside Rec Room or inside the editor. So the thing that we'll look at today is just how you can the thing we'll look at is trying to put these things together like from the back first. So like starting with our skybox, because obviously that's a good like starting representation for our scene, and a subtle detail that makes more difference than you might think, which is the fog color and how far away the fog is. So moving back on from here, just quick look back at drag and drop and the different things that we can use it for. We did, in the last lesson, we dragged things from the hierarchy to the project panel to make a prefab, and we dragged things from the project panel up to the hierarchy to spawn a prefab, or into the scene view. But one thing we didn't really do much of was dragging from the hierarchy or the project panel to the inspector. Anytime we drag something from the hierarchy or the project panel to the inspector, we're creating something that's called a reference. Now, you can tell any field that takes a reference is kind of just the address of something else. And in this particular case, a reference can be a reference to something that's in your, it can be a reference to either an object that's in your scene, an asset that's in your project panel, or it can be a component that's attached to one of your objects. But in any case, you'll know a field takes a reference by this little dot here. Any box that has a little dot like this, if you click on it, it will open up a little search box that will let you search everything in your scene. Well, not everything in your scene. It'll search through everything in your project that matches the type of thing that the reference is looking for. So you can see it says in brackets transform. So that's what this particular one is looking for. Anyone that says transform is looking for a game object. Over here, you can see this one is looking for a material. It's already assigned. However, these magic box, I call them magic boxes because they go both ways. If you click on one, if you click on the dot, it will show up a little menu where you can search for a thing. But if there is already something in there and you click on it, it will actually teleport you either in the hierarchy or the project panel, depending on which thing it is. It will teleport you straight to where that asset or reference lives, and it'll highlight in yellow so you can see it. And so we use this to track down a texture or two in a bit. One other thing to note is obviously, since we're working with materials today, I don't know if you can see it, but there is a tiny little gray indent in this red circle. And when we're working with materials, you'll see that a lot, along with our little telltale reference circle. And that means that this is a reference that takes a picture or a texture. And it works the same way as any of the other reference boxes. If you click it, it'll take you to where the texture lives, or if you press the dot, it'll search. But it's just very subtle. It's one of the hardest things to see in the UI. So if you're not used to looking for it, it can be a little tricky to spot. I was supposed to talk over this slide before, but it pretty much, just reference is an address, can be an object, can be an asset, it can be a component. But the best way to get your head around them is to see them in action. So we'll see a little bit of this later. But the rule of thumb is if you drag and drop something into the inspector anywhere, you're setting a reference. Another thing that we'll be going over today is the lighting panel. And we'll be taking Benchy from his nice little seaside spot that he's got over here, to somewhere a little darker, a little bit more moody. Benchy's gonna be set up for a bit more of like telling a spooky story. But we're mainly gonna do that with the help of the lighting panel. Now the way you get to the lighting panel, I'll show you this again in a second. But you just hit Window, Rendering, and Lighting. There's quite a few things that live here in this, and it'll be overwhelming to start with. But don't worry. We'll visit each of the ones of these that we actually need to visit, one by one. As you can see, there's a few different things that the lighting panel lets us do. This is how you unset a skybox. Is by clicking on this reference and setting it to null. The sun source is not too important for most things, but it is if you want to have a Rec Room Studio room that uses the regular Rec Room skybox. So like, if you want to still be able to change the mood and other aspects of the sky with circuits, then you need to have your sun source set to a directional light. And we'll take a look at what a directional light is in a second. We also have the option to adjust the intensity of the environment lighting, control little bits of the environmental reflections, and to control the fog. I'll notice a lot of these have similarities with the controls we can use on the sky in CV2, and a lot of the controls a lot of the chips we have for setting up the sky in CV2 are just calling these functions behind the scenes. So, heading back to materials. What is a material? Well, in real life, a material is just the physical substance that something is made of. So that would include like sort of how strong it is, like what sound it makes when you hit it. All of these things that are dictated by its atomic structure. In RRS, a material is a set of numbers/image parameters for a shader. And a shader is a program that tells Unity how it should actually draw the picture of an object. So that's what this was going over roughly. In real life, a shader might be an artist who only does shading and no line work. I don't know if that's actually a thing, but maybe in big animation studios it is. In Unity/Rec Room Studio, a shader tells the GPU how to color an individual pixel. And this is the worst illustration ever. But let's say this square is 1 pixel. For every pixel that you ever see in Rec Room, or any other game for that matter, for the most part, that pixel fires a ray out into the scene, and it strikes the surface of an object. And then it asks, okay, well, what color should this pixel be, given that I've hit this? And that's what the shader does. But the shader itself has a set of instructions. But not necessarily, a shader can take a lot of different settings to dictate how it should make a thing look. So in that sense, the shader's kind of like the bread in the sandwich, but it has no filling by default. And the materials, so like the textures and the numbers that we give the material, are kind of like the filling in the sandwich. If that doesn't make any sense, don't worry, it doesn't need to. We'll see how they work in practice in a second. So, material parameters over here, this is what happens if you inspect a shader. You'll never need to do this, but you can see it's got a big old list of parameters here. And then, in practice, when we look at a material, you'll see we get all of these different settings. Different images we can put in there, different drop-downs, different boxes we can check, different numbers we can add in. And it's the shader that actually defines what these are. And then Unity makes a nice little sort of set of buttons for us that are much easier to work with than that. So in Rec Room Studio, we only really deal with 5 distinct shaders. Possibly 4. It's a small number. We have RRS lit / RRS lit particle, and that is pretty much the standard shader that you use for most solid objects. Like if you want it to be a normal thing that gets affected by lighting, we use RRS lit. RRS unlit, as the name implies, is for things that are not affected by lighting. So anything that you want to like glow in the dark unconditionally, or just look any texture or thing that you want to look exactly the same as it looked in Photoshop, color and lighting wise, we use unlit for that. RRS foliage is an interesting one. if you use foliage on something, the controls for this foliage look a little bit different, but the foliage shader does something we call a vertex transformation, which you don't really need to understand the ins and outs of that. But with the foliage shader on something, it'll be wavy, like it's moving with the wind. And so that's what they use on like the leaves on the trees in the, what's it called, in Rec Royale. Those are using the foliage shader. And you can use that on trees or grass or anything that you'd expect to be blowing in the wind. But you're not limited to just using it for trees and grass. So if you want to put it on a building and make the building disturbingly ripple in the wind, then you can do that too. Finally, we have the Skybox, Rec Room Skybox, and the standard Skybox shaders. And they do exactly what their name suggests. They're the ones that draw the Skybox. Now, there's a few different roles. In the standard RRS lit shader is what we call a PBR, or a physically based rendering shader. And it accepts a few different textures to describe what a material should look like. And so I've just lined up a list of them here and what they kind of look like when you combine them. So our diffuse is just a regular color texture, like something you might see drawn in Photoshop. Like if you just take a photo of something, like that's effectively the diffuse texture. But in practice, diffuse textures tries to capture as little lighting information as about the surface as possible. The diffuse is just trying to capture color. The bump map, or the normal map as it's technically called, bump makes it a little, I say bump because, you know, it looks like a bumpy surface, and it tells Unity, okay, this is what the texture of this surface should look like. Like, technically each of these pixels is a different direction that light should bounce in when it hits the surface of an object. We have occlusion, which is this, you can see the effect of this is a lot more subtle. What the occlusion map does, and in practice Rec Room doesn't actually use occlusion hardly ever, but the spot is still there in the shader for it. And what the occlusion does is it specifies areas that light should not be hitting the material. So it's pretty much just a set of things that, like, okay, make these areas darker and don't make them brighter, no matter how much light hits the material. And Specular, I picked a really bad example for Specular, but don't worry, we'll see some better examples later on. But Specular tells Unity what color, if an object is shiny, what color the shine should be. And we have a couple of different modes that the Specular texture can operate in. So on one mode, it describes how metallic things should look. So like how much it should look like shiny metal. But Rec Room doesn't usually use that mode. They use what they call Specular mode, which is where the Specular texture just tells you what color something should be when it shines. And we'll see that in action in a second. The other parameters that we have, which in this case are just regular numbers that go from like 0 to 1, is our Specular, which is it's roughly how shiny, like how reflective the material is. But that's distinct from roughness or smoothness. So we don't actually have a roughness parameter, we have a smoothness parameter. This is not a very good example because I took it from Blender. But if you dial your smoothness all the way up, it looks shiny, but it kind of looks like shiny car paint, right? It doesn't, it's reflecting the world around it, but not like perfectly. Whereas metallic dictates how much, like, just raw reflection ends up in your material. Like how much does it look like metal? And just going into the surface options on that shader, it's this little box is the first thing that shows up when you try and edit the material. There's just a couple of things to look at there. So metallic and specular workflow mode, that was what I mentioned before. Metallic means that the specular texture will tell you how metallic or shiny it is, whereas specular just sets what color the reflections are. Surface type is an important one. If you hung around after class yesterday, you would have seen us mess with this. But if it's set to opaque, you can't see through this object at all. Even if its texture says it should have transparency, it won't have any transparency. You won't be able to see through. Whereas if it's transparent, you can make it either partially or fully see-through. Render face is a little bit of a tricky one to work with. That's one that's also much easier to demonstrate, so we'll demonstrate it shortly. But roughly speaking, if your render face is set to front, that's normal. You can see the outside of an object. If your render face is set to back, you will see right through the front of an object, and you'll see the back side of it instead. And if it's set to both, then you can see both sides at the same time. In practice, it's usually set to front, because you can only generally see an object from the angle you're looking at it from. Now, alpha clipping, this one's a little important, and it confuses people a bit. Alpha clipping means that you can set a threshold for transparency on the texture, whereby, and you would have seen this with our duct tape, right? Like it had that black background on it, and when we enabled transparency, the black background disappeared. Alpha clipping means that you can set a threshold for transparency on the texture at which the object will be see-through. Only fully see-through or not see-through at all, but it will be see-through even if it is set to opaque. And that's what gets people a lot when they're trying to set materials for their trees, which we'll do next lesson, is trees don't work very well when they're set to transparent. Anything that you're going to see layered over the top of each other doesn't actually work very well with transparency in Rec Room. And for those situations, we'd actually use opaque with alpha clipping on. If none of that made any sense, don't worry, we're going to go over it a few more times. But I'm just trying to lay it out here, all out here for you now, so you have some hooks to hang that on. Now, reflection probes is the last little extra detail that we're going to go over today. And a reflection probe is just a thing that tells Unity/RRS what should the reflections on a shiny object look like for a given area. Like, obviously, in an ideal world, the reflections would just always update based on where the object was in real time. But in practice, that's a lot of extra rendering to do, and on most devices, it's going to bring your frame rate down massively, which is why Rec Room doesn't let us do that, even though the engine supports it. So in practice, what we'll do is we will put these little mirror balls around the room, and we'll do something called baking the reflection, which is just to say we're going to take a little 360 screenshot and stick that in there, and that'll tell reflective objects in the scene what they should be reflecting. Now would be a perfect time to go ahead and download Benchy if you haven't already. My bad, I was supposed to tell you to do that beforehand, and then I didn't, so L for me. But our Benchy for this lesson just lives in the Lesson 2 resources. And just at the bottom of this channel, you'll see the Unity package for Benchy Lesson 2. So go ahead and save that somewhere where you'll be able to find it. And be like, do you want to override it? I'm like, yes, I do. And then, same as last time, we'll head on over to Assets, Import Package, Custom Package, and we will choose our Lesson 2 Benchy. Now, mine will look a little bit different because this time I didn't blow away all of the files before I continued. But yours should have the full list of everything that we're going to need today. So going on over to this would have imported our RRS Speedrun tutorial Lesson 2 folder. And here we can go and drag out our Lesson 2 Benchy out into the scene, ready for us to work with. So for what we'll do first, we're going to try and set ourselves up a little bit of mood lighting for Benchy. So we'll expand our instructions here for Benchy, and the first thing we're going to do is, there's nothing wrong with our skybox that we have here, but it's a pretty bright, sunny skybox. We're going to go for a little more of a cloudy, spooky sort of mood this time around. So we're going to clear our skybox out. Now, just as a quick recap from what we did last lesson. Last lesson, we put this sort of nice, bright blue, sort of happy-looking skybox into our scene, but I didn't actually show you how to clear it. To hit Window, then Rendering, and then Lighting, which summons the lighting panel for us. But by default, it summons us to the Scene pill, which doesn't actually have anything that's useful for us in Studio. In Studio, we'll be doing all of our things with the lighting panel from the Environment pill up here. So the next instruction on this one is how we unset a reference. Now this works if you want to unset your skybox reference, but it also works on any other reference. So any other field that has this little dot next to it, if you want to empty it, you can click on it, type none in the search bar that comes up, then double click on that, and voila, the sky is gone. And so that's our first bit. So we'll drill down to step 2, and I unhelpfully put my lighting panel over the top of my every other panel. So I'll probably dock it just over here on the left-hand side. I realized I didn't actually tell you guys that you can do this. Any of these tabs can actually be rearranged to any other place within the Unity UI. I generally recommend keeping this rough layout, since most people assume that you have it. But especially if there's tabs that you don't use all that often, like lighting, you can kind of just dock them up here alongside the inspector. And then switch back to the inspector when you're not using them. And so with that, we'll activate our next instruction, which is turning down the lights a little bit. You can see we've cleared our sky. And it's sort of, I was going to change it, but you know, that default gray is already looking a little bit ominous. But the rest of our lighting now looks a little bright for a place that doesn't look like it's seen the sun in decades. So if we pull our lighting panel back up, and our next little instruction says, let's change our ambient color and crank that down a bit. So by default, all of our shiny objects and any object that takes a bit of ambient lighting will be referring to the skybox for what color their reflection should be. But we can offset that color with this control here if you want your skybox lighting to be a little bit less or a little bit more. And in our case, we're just going to dial it all the way down so that we don't have any ambient lighting. So this control does the same thing regardless of whether you have a skybox texture or not. You can crank it down, you can crank it up. If you crank it up, everything gets much brighter. If you crank it down, everything gets much darker. So you can adjust that to suit the mood of what you're going for. But in this case, we're going to crank it right down as per the instructions. So we're going to just grab that value slider and set it to 0. We'll just double back onto that real quick. I have my color controls over here. This is the Unity color picker. You'll see this show up in a lot of places. Hue ring is over here, like saturation and value ring is over there. But if you want to try setting colors with a hex code, or just using RGB values, you can switch to this little drop down here to RGB 0 to 255, and it'll give you the more appropriate hex code style values. But I keep mine in HSV because it's easier for me to work with. So now that we've done all that, we're also going to take a look at our directional light that I alluded to earlier. Now, if you look at the directional light, if you double click on it to teleport us straight to it, it kind of just looks like a cylinder pointing straight down. But the directional light is not very aptly named because the directional light should really be called a sunlight. That's what the sun is. That's why it has this little sun icon, and that's why that's what the sunlight actually is in all of your default rec room rooms. Is there's only one directional light, and it's this one. It's the sun. And so, like I said earlier, if we want to be able to control the sky with circuits, which we don't necessarily in this case, but it's good to have it assigned just in case you want to. If you want to be able to control it, make sure you have this sun source set. And we can do that just by dragging our directional light from the left-hand panel here over to the right-hand panel. That's an aside. It's not in the instructions, and it's not going to be important, but I just thought I'd let you know about that. But our directional light, you'll see that the opposite direction of where the directional light is pointing looks to be where the lighting is coming from in our scene. And you'll see, if we go to rotation mode and we turn it around, that the lighting in our scene kind of turns around with it. Because right now, that's where all of our lighting is coming from. In this particular case, we don't want to get rid of our lighting entirely, but we're going for a bit more of a mood lighting sort of a vibe. So we're going to turn down the intensity multiplier over here, just like it says over in our instructions. So the intensity is just how bright the light is. And if we turn this one right down, I just realized that's still the lighting panel, not the inspector. My bad. So we don't have a slider for that one, but we can still. Now this is a fun little thing. If you hover over any label that has a number next to it and you click and hold, you can slide that value up and down, which makes it a little bit of fun to play with. Of course, if you're after a precise value, you can always write a number in the old-fashioned way and turn it down that way. And so you can see now we've turned down our background lighting. It's looking a little darker, a little more dreary. So let's see if we can add in a bit of mood lighting for Venti to tell all of their story with. So we've done all of this one. So let's head over into the hierarchy and unhide our instructions for step 3. And so for this one, we're going to add just a little bit of mood lighting for Venti. So as you can see here, we do that from in the hierarchy panel. We will choose light. And the first one we'll add is just a point light. Now, if you've worked with lights in Rec Room at all, these are going to look pretty familiar. Directional light, as we discussed before, that's the sun. Point light is a light emanating from a single point, just like it is in Rec Room. And spotlight is an area that covers a given spot, just like it is in Rec Room. So we'll add ourselves a little point light to start with. And I'm sure there is a way around this, and I'll hopefully look up what it is later. But by default, when you spawn things, a lot of them show up in unideal locations, but that's okay. We can just drag this over here. I thought we might as well put it so that it looks like our Venti's little light bulb is actually lighting up the scene a bit. I'm thinking looks like we got a bit more of a ambient mood going on there. If you want to, you can adjust your color to make the mood feel a little different depending on what sort of thing you like. But as you can see, the way that we choose to put our lights can make a big difference on how our scene feels. Now this is more of a demo, just for the sake of showing you how to change some properties on materials. But so we put in a point light, and just for the sake of it. If you want to add a couple of extra lights, you can. We might add a little spotlight too, just so you can see what that does. It's got its little spot showing up there. Maybe Venti just really wants to have that little bit of like, ooh, I'm telling a story with a torch under my face or over my face in this case, sort of vibes. Can add that there if you feel so inclined. If I did that too fast, all I did was adjust the intensity. Like in Rec Room, you can also adjust the range of lights, which just affects how far they will shine. If you're after like a really weak flashlight beam, you can set that range to a little bit shorter. But now that we've put that in, let's say now that it's getting a little bit darker, we want Venti's face to glow in the dark, just so we can see them nice and easily. This is a bit of a silly example, but there are plenty of times where in your scenes you will want materials to glow in the dark. So I figured this would be a good example to demonstrate how to do that. So we'll go ahead and we'll uncheck the instructions for number 4. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new material, which we have actually created several new materials already, but we haven't done it manually by hand. We've been using a few shortcuts that UMD has built into it. So to do this, all we do is we'll navigate back into our project folder, since that's always a good place to put stuff that we want organized. Now I've created a folder for lesson 2. You don't strictly have to do that, but I'd recommend it. And then I've also created a folder called material. This is left over from the last lesson, so I'll delete these. And then I'll start this again from scratch. But create a new folder, just like we did before. So that's just right-click anywhere in the project panel, create, and then folder. Call that materials. And then we'll hit that same create button, so right-click in the project panel, over to create. And this time in this intimidating long list, we're going to choose material, which is roughly halfway down. And we'll call that glow face or something similar. Resolving packages? What you doing? This will happen every now and then. Like I said last lesson, the number one thing we spend time doing in Studio is waiting. Sometimes the things we wait for make sense. Sometimes they make no sense whatsoever. They, just one way or another, there is a lot of waiting. So that's one skill RRS definitely teaches you, is a bit of patience. But now that we've got that, so you've noticed up until this point we've always been clicking on items in the scene or in the hierarchy panel to highlight them in the inspector. This time we're going to be clicking on something in the project panel to mess with it in the inspector. And we have done that before when we worked with our sort of Rec Room object prefabs and other bits and pieces. But we'll be looking at this again now. So you can see our material doesn't look very glowy right now. But if you look down at our instructions here, there's a box on the settings. And just a quick throwback to the shaders here, you can see we have this shader label at the very top of the material editor. And that's actually the thing that lets us choose a shader to work with. Most of the things we're interested in will be here in Rec Room Studio. In the Rec Room Studio folder inside there. But for now, this is already on the shader that we want. So we're just going to check this little emission checkbox. This little preview here will show us what the material looks like, even if we don't have anything in the scene using that material yet. But you'll notice it's not looking very lit, even though we checked emission. So emission, to roughly explain that word, it just means it emits light, like a light bulb would. It doesn't actually light up the scene. Unity doesn't quite work that way, but it at least tells us, yeah, this is like, it's like those tiny little glow-in-the-dark stickers that you'd see every now and then. I don't know if they're still around. They were around when I was a kid. I absolutely love those things. But anyway, as per the instructions, we're going to turn our emission color up. Because it's currently all the way down at black, which is 0. And we can turn that up to a nice solid 1. And we want to give it a bit of color. I want to make Benji's face like a nice friendly, like yellow sort of glow. So I'm going to change my color over here to yellow, and I'm going to drag the saturation over to this side of the circle a little bit. And so now you can see our little demo sphere here is glowing, and our little representation of the material there is starting to glow. One thing that you need to be very aware of when you're dealing with anything that you're making glow, you'll see that our color indicator here in the emission slot has a HDR written across it, whereas our regular color fields don't have that. The main difference for a HDR color is a HDR color can take values that are outside of the regular like 0 to 255 range that pixels normally are. And that just means that Unity is going to pretend that it's glowing really, really bright. But effectively, this multiplies the amount of bloom that they get if you're making a neon material. Under no circumstances should you dial this up to 10 if you don't want to go blind. If you dial this all the way up to 10, and then actually drop this into Rec Room, if you can see a single pixel of this object, you will be completely blinded by how much glare there is on there. Generally, 1 is about, an intensity of 1 is about the regular amount of glow that a Rec Room neon material would have. And 2 is a fair bit distinctly brighter. You generally don't want to go any higher than 3. And like, if it's getting up to 3, it's something that you want to be like deliberately kind of blinding. But that's just a thing to bear in mind, that if you do want to make your glow materials like brighter or darker, keep an eye on that intensity. One more thing to note is that the glare doesn't affect Quest or mobile users, because that platform doesn't use glare. So now I'll show you the way that we manually assign a material. So we've assigned materials to a few things just by dragging and dropping them onto things directly. But sometimes you're going to want to do this the long way. And this is especially for objects that have more than one material on them. Now, in this particular case, Benchy's objects are all separated by material, so we won't run into that. But the way that you do it, as per the instructions, if you click on any of the objects that you're looking at, so that you get that little orange highlight to tell you it's selected. You'll see that in the inspector, now this may be collapsed for you. If it's collapsed under the mesh renderer section, which is the component that's actually responsible for drawing the object. If you click materials and you hit that drop down, you'll see there's a list here. It's only got one element in it. Don't try and add anything to it because it's not going to do anything. But you will run into objects that have more than one entry in here. And if you try and do the drag and drop method on something that has more than one entry in there, it's going to override all of them. So if there's more than one thing in that list, you need to do this the long way around, which, as I said before, we just click on it. And as per our little instruction here, we're going to click, and we're going to drag and hold. And we're going to go up to the first element in our materials list. So we get this little blue section and plus sign, and then we will let go. And then if we look at that, our benchy is glowing in the dark now. Nice and happy to see us. Now you might be wondering why we took that path such a long way around to get to the box. The reason we do that is because Unity has a nasty habit of assigning materials to things we don't want materials assigned to if we cut across the scene view. Like if I do this, you'll see it's randomly setting all sorts of things to be glowing. So that's why we go around. All right. So we'll move on to step 5. Actually, we won't move on to step 5 because step 5 has skipped this one because I started writing step 6 and then realized that I had never made a step 5. So this next thing we're going to do is we're going to use our... so what we're going to do now is we're going to use Specular to just give a quick demo of how the how specular maps work. And so we're going to take a pretty ordinary looking plane and we're going to write a little message on there. Now in this case you'll see that we have a few less instruction images, and that's just because a lot of these are things that I haven't that we've gone through before. But if you pay close attention to what's actually written here in the hierarchy, the first thing it says for us to do is make a plane. I did not click the right thing there. So just like we did when we made the plane last time, we'll choose the plus button from just under the hierarchy. We'll choose 3D object, and we'll choose plane. And that'll go with a plane that's a little further away than would be ideal. So we'll bring that plane up with the move tool, and then it's a little big right now, so we're going to scale it down with the scale tool. Shift that over a little bit. And then we'll make ourselves another material. So back in our materials folder in the project panel, we'll right click. Once again, we'll go up to create. We'll go over to material. And we'll call this one hidden message. And then in our hidden message, on our hidden message material, we'll go ahead and we'll set our workflow mode. This one's already highlighted because we just made it. We're going to change the workflow mode to Specular for a second. Just so that this texture actually behaves the way it's supposed to. And I have a nasty feeling that when I clicked delete, I accidentally deleted my message texture. But we can find out. And if you're ever trying to figure out whether you do or don't have a texture, remember this little inlet box here, which you can see that little indentation means that this is a field that takes an image reference. And if we click on the little dot, it'll actually open up a list of all of the images that we have that could go in this spot. And lo and behold, the one that I wanted isn't there. So I'll give you a quick run through on how we can make a test texture. All you need to do for that is to, if you right click anywhere in your project panel, just like we did when we were trying to import an image before, we'll right click in the project panel and we'll choose show in Explorer, which will take us to the RRS lesson 2 folder. We'll double click on there to make sure we've gone inside materials. Now, usually when you're doing a well-organized project, you'll keep your images and materials in separate folders. But for the sake of what we're doing here, and just to keep it quick. We won't do that. Then we can right click anywhere in here. And we can press new. This might not actually... Okay, I just realized some people will have their explorers configured differently to mine. So instead we'll just pull up good old MS Paint from our search bar. And we'll throw us up a little message. Well, actually, we'll fill it in dark, because we kind of want only a little bit of this to be shiny. We'll set our brush thickness to a little bit wider. I'll just write ourselves a little message in glorious mouse handwriting that says hi there, or whatever you feel like. And then we'll save that one. Now, much like we did when we were saving an image from the internet or from Discord, we can save this into the right place by just choosing our folder that we opened from the project panel. We can click at the empty spot at the end of the address bar here, copy it, then click at the empty spot at the end of the Paint Save dialog, paste that here, and just press enter, and it'll take us to the right place. We'll rename this message.png, but you can leave it as untitled if it's giving you any trouble. Let's hit save on that one. And if we navigate back to Unity, same as when we imported our duct tape, you'll see it's magically appeared. And what we'll do now is we'll click back on our hidden message material, and we're going to drag our message texture into the specular map slot. So that's over here in the material inspector under surface options, surface inputs, and it's this second one here. And you'll see this little square highlights blue when it's actually ready for us to drag something in there. And you'll see this looks a little interesting. But if we go ahead and actually drag our material onto the plane now, so just like we did for the face, we're going to take it from down here. Now we'll do this the quick and easy way like we did last time, because we know this plane is only going to have one material. So we'll drag it out of the inspector and just right onto the plane. But you can see there that our material is extra shiny in the place where we painted the dark bits. And so that's what in specular mode at least, that's what our specular texture governs. You'll see we also have the smoothness slider here right above it, and if we dial that all the way down, you'll see that the area that we painted on isn't all that metallic or shiny looking anymore. And if you dial it way up, you'll see it looks like very kind of sleek and smooth. And you can also, if you're interested, switch that to metallic, just to see what the metallic version does. Do note, if you switch these, it actually changes the shader slightly, so it clears this. So you'll need to drag that back in there. But if you have that in there as the source of the metallic map instead, it pretty much does the same thing. It's just that the background looks a tiny bit different. But if in doubt, and you want it to match Rec Room's style, keep it in specular mode, because as you'll see in a minute, most of the materials that Rec Room uses are using that specular workflow. And you'll see the difference that makes in a little bit. We won't see it right now, but we'll just put our little demo tile down there for the time being. We'll pull up a similar exercise, which is just to show you what bump maps look like in isolation. So we'll pull open those, and it ends up being a very similar sort of exercise. We'll reuse the same plane for it even. No trips to paint.net this time. But what we'll do is we'll create one more material down here. And we'll call that material just bumpy. And we're going to show you what a normal map does to a surface. So this time we're going to drag the material onto the plane first, just so we can see this change take place. So if you make your bumpy material, drag it onto the plane. And this time, we won't make our own one this time because normal maps are a little tricky to make, but Rec Room has already provided plenty of ones for us. So if you, as per the instructions, you'll see it says, yeah, let's hit that normal map little reference bubble, and then we're going to search for norm. So if we click up here and we search, now this accepts any sort of texture, but for normal maps specifically are a very odd looking texture. Every normal map, and you'll see this if you type in norm, it's going to be this odd little shade of purple. And that's just the way that normal maps are encoded. But I encourage you to take, once you've searched for norm, you will have pulled up all of the normal maps that Rec Room gives us to work with by default. And I encourage you to just put this over somewhere that you can see it, or where you can still see your main material panel, and just flick through a few of these, because you'll see that as you do, especially if you move in a little bit closer to that, my search window disappeared. Let's type in norm again. But as you scroll through these, you're going to get a very different looking surface on your material every time you switch one of these. And that's because normal maps kind of tell the engine what sort of relief should this surface have. Like what does this surface look like it should feel like, for lack of a better word. And so you can see we've got all kinds of like fun little ones that we can deal with here. But I just wanted to make sure you could see in no uncertain terms what a normal map did. If you want, we have a little number next to the normal map, and that will actually let us dial the influence of it up and down too if you feel so inclined. So if you feel like your normal map isn't quite giving you as much contrast as you'd like, you can dial it up, and the holes that it puts in something will be far more distinct. Or if you feel like it's a little over the top, you can dial it down and they'll become more subtle. Now, I love normal maps. They're one of my absolute favorite things because you can make something look like it has a lot more detail than its geometry would suggest. But do be warned, you don't want to put anything super important in your normal maps if you're targeting lower end platforms, because Quest and some Android users can't see normal maps. So that's just a warning to go along with that one. So our next set of instructions is to make a mirror ball. Now this is going to do a little 2-in-1 for us. First, it's going to show us how to mess with the shininess slider on our materials. And 2, it's going to give us a perfect excuse to look at reflection probes. So again, this will be one of those ones where we're going to want to take a quick look at what the instructions actually tell us to do. Sorry that I haven't been following along with those ones each time. That's what I should be doing. But if we click on if we look at our make a mirror ball instructions, our first one says we'll make a new material. So yet another new material. We'll call this one shiny. So again, back to the project panel, back to material, and then shiny. And this time, as per the little instruction card here, we're going to crank the smoothness all the way up, and you'll see our material gets visibly shinier as we do this. And we'll crank our metallic all the way up. Now, you would have noticed as it was doing that it actually got darker. But that's just because we don't have a skybox in this room, so right now it's trying to reflect just plain darkness. But we're going to change that. But for now, you'll see the next thing that it tells us to do is create a sphere. And just like we did for creating a plane, if we want to create a sphere, we've got the little reference card down here. We go up to plus under the hierarchy panel. We're going to choose 3D object, and we're going to choose sphere. And we'll drag this one over so it's actually somewhere a little bit more convenient for us to work with. And we'll put this right over here next to Benchy's face. And we'll go ahead and we'll assign that material. Now, you can either do this using the drag and drop method, or we can do it by assigning the material in the material list over here. Up to you. I recommend you get some practice with both methods. Drag and drop is far more fun. Checking the individual elements on these will really only be important if you're working with imported models. But that is something you do a lot in Studio, so I recommend you get a bit of practice with it. So you can see now that we've assigned our shiny material to this ball, it's looking like it's just chilling there in complete and utter darkness. And that's because the engine doesn't have any reflection information for this part of the scene now that the skybox is gone. It usually defaults to the skybox, but we haven't given it a skybox. So instead, we're going to make ourselves a reflection probe that will let them see it. So if we hit let Benchy see their face in the mirror ball, we'll open up that step 9 set of instructions. Now I'm realizing that I've been horribly remiss in here, and I actually forgot to write a couple of the steps in there. But don't worry, we'll go through them nice and slow. So with our sphere selected, as per our instruction cards that appear over here, we're going to choose Add Component. And from the menu that shows up, we're just going to type in the letters REF and choose Reflection Probe. And you'll see that when we do that, a little box is shown up. Now, if you like, we can... Where is my reflection probe? Okay, you have to scroll down a little bit in the inspector to see it. If we adjust our little box size controls here, it doesn't matter if you don't do this. I didn't put it in the instructions to do this, but this box determines what part of the scene your reflection probe says it represents reflections for. And this is probably more interesting when you do have a skybox, because you'll see if you put a dark reflection probe in that doesn't have anything in it, everything in that reflection probe box will get a lot darker. In this case, the opposite of that is going to happen. Now, the next thing we do that is regrettably not in the instructions is we, over on the right-hand side in our inspector, now we're going to scroll down a little bit, and we'll see this little bake button down the bottom. Now, if we go ahead and click that, you need to do your stop and load for a few moments. But then you'll see that our sphere, if we click away from it, now has a big old bright reflection of Benchy in it. It also looks a little brighter than perhaps it should. That's just because we've set our background color, or the background color by default is blue. If we click on our sphere again and look at our reflection probe component, we can go ahead and set that to a bit more of a gray, so it's a bit more consistent with what our outside looks like. And actually, we can make sure it matches it perfectly if we drag our color thing over here, click our eyedropper, and just click it on the sky. Oh, it made it cyan. Oh, right, because it's, okay, yours will work, mine won't, because you'll see when I use the eyedropper, it's actually taking the color of my little click highlighter rather than the color I'm looking for. So in my case, I'll pull a fast one. No, I won't, because we didn't check that manually. Don't worry, your one will work fine. I'm going to set this manually for the time being. If we go ahead and change that, and then hit bake again, it'll look exactly the same, only it'll look gray, so it just don't have that same blue tint to our thing. Oh, thanks, Tex. One more thing to note about reflection probes is that they are only going to reflect things that are specifically marked as static. So you'll see in our little mirror ball that we've created, one, you can't see the maker room off in the distance, and two, you can't see any of our little instruction panels. That's because I've gone through, in this case, and taken all of Benchy's geometry, which is under this little set of dashes, and I've given it a very subtle, but very important flag. That we'll be looking at this in a little bit more detail next lesson. But right up in here, next to the item's name in the inspector that says whether it's active or not, that's the most important checkbox. However, this static flag is probably the second most important checkbox. If you click the little drop down here, you'll see a few things that look very confusing in terms of their name. The only one we're interested in right now is reflection probe static, which is exactly as its name suggests. It means, okay, this object is going to stay still. Put it in the reflection probe. Generally, static just means, as opposed to dynamic, okay, this thing is not going to change much. It will stay where it is, so you can do all your calculations assuming that it's not going to move. Which pretty much, as a general rule, and there are some exceptions to this, but anything that isn't going to move, check static, and you will get more frames back. That's a rough rule of thumb. There's a lot more that we could go into with that, but for now, just know that that box is there. And if you want something to show up in a English. If you want it to show up in a reflection probe, check that box. And if we wanted to, just for the sake of the exercise, we could go over and select our maker room. Just for the record, if you're wondering how I'm doing that, I'm holding Shift and clicking, and it's selecting multiple elements at the same time. We could go ahead and mark that as static. Whenever you mark something as static, it'll ask you if you want to change the children as well. Generally, you always want to click yes. Then if we go back to our mirror ball and we bake our reflection probe again, we've made our mirror ball, and Benchy can see their face in it, so they're happy. We'll head on over to step 10, which if we check that box and expand it, we're finally going to complete our little storytelling atmosphere by bringing in some fog. Now, I alluded to that before. It's a very simple thing to do, but fog can be one of the biggest things that impacts the mood of your room, especially in VR. But in this case, we're just going to make our fog creep in a little bit. We're going to head up, back to the lighting panel, back to the environment tab, just in case you navigated away from it like I did. And we're going to check this fog box down here. So look at that if we check our fog box. And now you'll see that we do have a mode button here that gives us a couple other modes to work with. But linear is the only one Rec Room supports, which is just as well for us. That's the one it starts on. Now the fog controls, the start dictates how close to you the fog will finish. If you change that one, you won't often see a lot of difference. What we're usually interested in is the end of the fog. That said, if you only want your fog to affect distant objects, you'd set this start to something like 100. This distance is measured in meters, and that just means that anything within 100 meters, it will not be affected by the fog. It'll be exactly the color that it would be if there was no fog, and the fog will start to kick in at about 300 meters away. But in our case, we're looking for some dense kind of creepy fog. So we're going to dial this all the way down until we see it start to creep in a little bit. I think I ended up setting mine to like a 74.3. And you can see now that we've done that, like the end of our shelves are starting to disappear, but up into the distance. If we look out to our maker room, it's looking pretty gloomy and scary from here. That was just the last little bit of thing we were going to do to cement our atmosphere here for Benchy. Now the only other thing that I realized that we forgot to cover last time, so that's what we can do with our fog, is we didn't actually set up Benchy so you can walk on it. I remember when I loaded up the demo room last time, I actually fell right through it. So I thought I'd quickly show you how to sort that out. I don't think I actually put in any instruction images for that one. But there's a nifty little thing you can do if you need to add collision to anything box-shaped that you have a mesh renderer for. Now, just to clarify, you do need to make sure that you have a mesh render component on the thing. You can find that out very quickly just by double-clicking on it. If you can click on the thing, chances are it already has a mesh renderer. And if you want to give that some collision, all you have to do is, same way as we added the reflection probe component, if we click on this one, mine is play material 005. This isn't very helpfully named because this is just a bench that I took from Sketchfab. But if we choose add component down here, and this time we'll search for box, which will give us a box collider. And you will see that we have a collider that is perfectly sized to fit our bench. And now that we've done that, Studio knows what it is that we should be able, what part of this object we should be able to walk on. And just a little bit more of background there. By default, Studio will treat every object like Rec Room treats a decorational object. It doesn't treat it as something that you can actually collide and interact with unless we put this collider component on it. We did cover that a little bit last lesson, but I thought I'd just reiterate. If you are interested in making it fully cover the geometry of what you're interested in, you'll want to use something called a mesh collider, which we'll go into next lesson, but we can quickly take a look at it now. If we uncheck the box collider, exact same way that you added the box collider, if you search mesh in here instead and choose a mesh collider, then it will attempt to make a collider that follows the mesh of this exactly. Now, mesh colliders can get a little tricky in terms of there are a few rules surrounding mesh colliders. You don't want to put them on a mesh that's too that has a lot of curved surfaces on it, so you don't want to put it on something that's too polygon dense. I'll explain what that is next lesson as well when we cover models. But if you do want something that actually completely hugs the surface of your object, mesh collider is the one that you want. So that was the end of the scripted content that I have for today. If you want to go ahead and upload your room and see what your spooky mood looks like, feel free to just disable the instructions and go ahead and do that. You can keep your demo playing or not at your own discretion. Again, just to recap, it's up here in Rec Room Studio.
Thanks everyone for joining. For more Rec Room Studio content, make sure to join our class Discord server and check out our YouTube channels.